Chapter 6.
Was he setting up bear traps so the tax collectors wouldn't take his money?
Shirk asked after they had been walking for a while. It was rather effective, it seems, Tarhoon responded.
So is all this me tax collectors?
Shirk wondered. They noticed a torn cloth hanging from a tree nearby, and it looked to be the garb of the realm's tax collectors. Shirk stopped to look at it.
I feel slightly less bad these people got killed now. When this is done, I would love it if we could make that cabin into a base of operations or something. That would be great.
Tarhoon felt around the cloth to see if there was anything useful to scavenge, but found nothing. Sounds great to me, Fee agreed cheerfully.
I could get a little garden set up. Get a fountain.
Shirk trailed off, lost in thought. What do we need a garden for? All we need is shelter, Fee asked.
For food, Shirk responded.
We should proceed to the tower as soon as possible, Tarhoon insisted.
Gardening is very relaxing,
Shirk said, ignoring him. Yes, we do have someone else waiting for us, Elwood replied, ignoring Shirk in turn. This is all entirely useless until we have completed our mission, Tarhoon added.
Patience is its own reward,
Shirk said calmly. Tarhoon sighed aggressively. As we all die to the beasts of the night, he spat back. I don't find that very comforting. It is the morning, Tarhoon, Elwood replied, apparently unconcerned despite his earlier sentiment they should move on. As they reached the crest of a large hill, they were able to get a clear view of the entire valley. They saw that, just as the map had shown, the river cut an unnatural zigzag pattern across the valley. They would need to cross two of them in order to reach the tower. The third was between the tower and a valley farther north. They continued to walk. As Fee seemed interested, Tarhoon began to speak to her about the teachings of Bahamut and the different tenets of his belief. Gradually, they came across two kobolds and a zombie crossing their path. Tarhoon tensed up immediately, the urge to destroy the abomination rising. He managed to suppress the desire with difficulty, but watched the zombie cross their path with contempt. The kobolds stared at the party as they walked. We mean you no harm, Elwood called out cheerfully. We're on our way to your master, the king of the forest. Are you friend or... the zombie began to say.
Yes, friend, we are friend,
Shirk said, sounding irritated. Unlike the last zombie, this zombie was clearly not fresh. Sores and wounds oozed pus and blood leached from its body. The foul stench wafted toward Tarhoon, and he held his nose in disgust. Visitors, we are seeing the king of the forest, Elwood clarified.
We were invited by the king of the forest, Shirk added, like he specifically invited us, he said in a mock, dignified tone.
The corpse said in clear confusion.
Do you want proof? Shirk demanded.
Friend or foe? The zombie asked again. Friend, the four all said at once. Neat, the zombie replied, and began to meander off in a different direction. The kobolds followed after it. Have a good day, Elwood shouted after them. As the zombie shambled off, its belt, which had precariously hung to its tattered waist, fell to the ground. A pouch was attached to it. Tarhoon began to walk toward it, but Shirk took the opportunity to pounce upon the pouch to see what was inside. Sir, you forgot your... Elwood trailed off, seeing both Shirk and Tarhoon go for the pack. The zombie ran into a tree, redirected itself, and walked on. The kobolds pointed their spears at it, attempting to shepherd their companion. Have fun, Elwood finished instead. Tarhoon moved to outpace Shirk, but seeing the zombie moving even farther away, decided against it. He was suddenly surprised by Elwood bursting past him, outrunning Shirk, who was now quite close to the sack, and snatching it from right in front of him. Shirk looked at Elwood with a mixture of sadness and annoyance. Elwood freed an object from the sack, and Tarhoon saw that it appeared to be a very old book. "Calm down, everyone. It's just a book," Elwood informed the party.
"Bah! Fine, keep it,"
Shirk replied bitterly, although Tarhoon suspected it was less at the loss, and more that there was simply nothing valuable inside. "Here, you can have the belt, though." Elwood slipped the sack off the belt and passed it to Shirk.
"Yes!"
Shirk cried in triumph, holding the belt high. "And you, Tarhoon, you can have the sack." Elwood smirked as he handed the dirty bag to the Dragonborn. Tarhoon gave him an unamused look. "And I shall have the book," Elwood said happily. He began to open the book at arm's length. "Be careful with that," Fee told him. Shirk's face fell as he realized the belt had only fallen off because time had worn apart the leather, breaking it in half. So his object was even more useless than Tarhoon's was. Elwood, having discovered the book didn't seem to be innately dangerous, pulled it closer and began to examine it more closely. Tarhoon peered over Elwood's shoulder and saw that it was an old, dusty book, bound in leather. The letters on the inside seemed to be the same kind that were used by most people, but they were garbled and scrambled beyond understanding. Tarhoon lifted up the pages on the first one, which only read, "Property of Salazar." Elwood flipped the back of the book and pointed out what looked to be a cipher. The date at the top of the page was clear enough, and indicated that the most recent entry was from about a year ago. Realizing they'd been walking for a while, the group decided to sit down and take a rest to heal their injuries from the fight, and to investigate the book. Tarhoon offered healing to those who needed it. While they did this, Shirk recounted the tale of the battle they had just fought, committing it to memory. After a short rest, Tarhoon stood and indicated that it was time to move on. Elwood and Shirk began to sing at different parts of the journey, and Tarhoon continued to explain different parts of the religion of Bahamut to Fee. A couple hours later, they reached an area where the trees became more thin and the terrain became more like a meadow, where they encountered the first of the two rivers. The part of the river they had come up against was fairly deep and swift. Shirk began to walk up the river to see if he could find a ford, but Tarhoon could clearly see this river was no match for him. There was no need for an alternate route.
"No, wait!"
Shirk cried as Tarhoon began to wade into the water. As Tarhoon made his way deeper, the swift water began to make the trek difficult. With each step, he drifted further and further downstream, but he would not be dissuaded. Like a rock, he held his ground, and it parted around him, even as his steps pulled him further downward. Finally, he gripped a sturdy log on the far side and hauled himself from the river, soaking but proud. He ran back up the riverside to where his companions were panicking, thinking he had been dragged farther down the river. He couldn't quite tell what was going on, but he could just make out Elwood grabbing a young tree, Shirk grabbing him, and loudly saying something Tarhoon couldn't make out. Elwood removed himself from Shirk and held up his hands in surrender. Fee stood passively off to the side. Shirk pointed aggressively upstream, then down, then threw his hands up in the air. Elwood pointed across the river. Tarhoon, realizing the others could not make it in the same manner he did, tried to think of alternate options. Inspiration struck. Tarhoon found a heavy rock, removed the hempen rope from the side of his pack, tied one end to the rock, and threw it over the river to land next to his companions. "Tie this to a tree, and then use the rope to cross the rapids," he yelled.
"What?"
Shirk yelled back across.
Fee! Tarhoon shouted again. Tie it to a sturdy tree, in such a way that you can get across, and then disconnect it from this side.
Okay, she yelled back. The others were discussing things across the river with rope in hand. Elwood pointed upriver to a section of rock outcropping with a small waterfall pouring over it. Tarhoon, Elwood yelled. We're going to head upstream toward that small waterfall. Perhaps there's a better chance of us crossing up there with the rope. So the group on the far side began moving toward the waterfall, and Tarhoon, reluctantly, took his end of the rope and began walking in the same direction. We're going to tie one end around our waists and try to walk across. If we slip, you can pull us, Fee shouted over to Tarhoon.
I'm still tying it to a tree, Tarhoon replied.
He grumbled under his breath, wondering why they wouldn't just listen to him and tie it to a tree on their end. But what could he do?
Go right ahead,
Shirk responded in sarcastic dismissal. Tarhoon glared at him. Both parties reached the waterfall, which appeared to be roughly 8 feet tall. Tarhoon climbed up his side, and then looked over to see Shirk and Fee trying to convince Elwood of something. They clearly must not have succeeded, because Tarhoon watched, stunned, as Elwood backed up and attempted to run directly up the side of the 8-foot rock wall. He made it 2 steps up before realizing in a panic that the plan would not succeed, did an excellent flip, and landed back on the ground. Tarhoon's mouth hung open at the man's sudden onset of arrogant stupidity. Elwood gripped Shirk's hand, and Shirk pulled him up. Once at the top, the river was more quiet, and Tarhoon could hear what the others were saying. What he heard did not fill him with confidence.
Could I throw one of you across? Shirk suggested.
That does not seem like a wise idea. Just take the rope, Tarhoon replied.
The rope that's downstream? Shirk smiled and raised an eyebrow. We're over here.
No, I brought it with us, Fee pointed out. Shirk noticed the rope in her hands. Tarhoon tied his end of the rope to a tree as Shirk wordlessly took it and tied it around his own waist. Then he began to ford his way across the river. While it was much more shallow here, only going up to Shirk's waist where it had been up to Tarhoon's chest, it was still quite rapid. Tarhoon pulled Shirk as much as he could in an effort to get him across safely. Almost in slow motion, Shirk's legs swept out from under him, and he began being dragged downriver by the current. Tarhoon dug in his heels and tried to stop the pulling as much as he could, but the rope was too long for him to be able to help as much as he would have liked. He cursed the lack of strength to save his companion. Shirk managed to grip onto a rock that was in the way and clung to it for dear life. Tarhoon sighed with relief for a moment, but he realized this was no time to relax. His eyes widened with horror as he watched Elwood take a running jump across the river directly onto Shirk. Shirk's success at grabbing the rock was almost instantly undone as Elwood slammed into the bugbear. Shirk kept hold, but his desperate attempt to grab hold of Elwood failed, and Elwood was swept over the waterfall and downriver. Tarhoon wondered how this had all gone so horribly wrong, but he was somehow entirely certain that if they had gone with his method, everything would have gone much more smoothly than this. Tarhoon attempted to pull Shirk from the water once more, but yet again Shirk remained in the water's power. Tarhoon glanced down in horror at his hands, confused by the repeated failure of his strength. His father would be ashamed of him. The sound of Shirk's voice pulled him back to the present.
Be like a salmon! For the love of Bahamut, Elwood, be like a salmon!
Unfortunately, Elwood was too far down now to hear Shirk's voice.
Why aren't you being like a salmon?
Shirk yelled desperately to Elwood, who was being swept further downstream. Tarhoon saw an arrow, shot by Fee, arc gracefully across the river next to him. A rope was attached to it, and seeing that Shirk was, for the moment, relatively safe, Tarhoon secured the other rope to another tree. Fee, at least, somehow managed to get across with no trouble. Tarhoon would have new respect for her on this later, but now was not the time. Working together, the two finally managed to haul Shirk to shore. As soon as Shirk had made it, Tarhoon dashed away, charging downstream. He leapt down the 8-foot drop without slowing, and kept on. Soon he was able to better see the wet bag that was Elwood. Two short swords plunged desperately into the log that was barely clinging to the riverbank. "I am not made to swim!" Elwood cried. As Tarhoon ran, he pulled his rope back to him, assuming Shirk had untied himself by now. He guessed right, and when he reached the end, he threw the rope to Elwood as well. Fortunately, the rock he had tied to it earlier was still there, allowing the end of the rope to sail right next to Elwood. Elwood grabbed the rope quickly and dislodged his sword as the log that he had plunged into went tumbling down the river. Shirk and Fee arrived a moment later, and the three hauled the waterlogged half-elf to the bank. "I don't like water," Elwood cried angrily. "Please, just take the easy way next time," Fee requested. "Next time," Tarhoon said, looking at each member of the group in the eyes. "We take my route," he told them forcefully. "Then I'd be even further downstream," Elwood protested. "I was suggesting that we tie one end to a tree on each side and hold on to it as we pull our way across. Next time, we assume that I actually know what I'm doing," Tarhoon retorted. "Next time," Elwood got up and pointed at Shirk, "you are throwing me." Tarhoon sighed and closed his eyes. Clearly, they hadn't learned anything.
"I just thought we'd try to do it at a place that had a shorter distance,"
Shirk told Tarhoon unapologetically. "Trees. Totally fine. I love trees. They're great. But water? No! I'm not doing the water thing again," Elwood ranted. Tarhoon glared at Shirk. He hated the bugbear. He knew his father would stay collected and not let it faze him, and he knew that he should follow his father's example. The fact that this was getting to him simply made him hate the bugbear all the more.
"As for you," Shirk turned to Elwood, "why on earth would you think jumping on my back like that was a good idea?"
Shirk spent the next several minutes shouting at the half-elf about how monumentally stupid that was. They carried on walking and began to make good headway. In time, Shirk gradually fell silent and then spoke up again.
"So I know this is something we haven't really talked about, and haven't really planned, but what are we going to do when we meet the King of the Forest, friends?"
"We will meet the King of the Forest, and then we'll decide," Tarhoon replied.
"That's against the whole point of making plans,"
Shirk refuted. "Deciding what we're going to do when we meet him doesn't sound like a good idea," Fee agreed. "It's unneeded," Tarhoon spat back. "He just wants to talk to us," Elwood said. "Other than that, we know nothing. We do also know he believes this land is his area, and we have been granted safe passage through this area."
"We should seriously try to think of what we say when we're going to get in there," Shirk insisted. "We don't want to just walk in there and be like, 'Hey, King dude, how's it going?' Slap him on the back, shake his hand, and then he kills us instantly."
"How much do we know about him enough to make that kind of plan?" "That he controls an army of undead," Fee pointed out.
"Yeah, that's one. That's one point." Shirk turned to Fee. "Thank you. That's one point in the do not trust him column."
"He also claims that his lands have been stolen unjustly," Tarhoon replied, "which would be perfectly justified if true."
"Sure. That doesn't mean we have to be without an idea of what to do when we get in there."
"What do you suggest?" Tarhoon relented.
"I suggest we make some... We I don't know. I'm not very smart. I'm just coming up with an idea. I'm an idea man, Shirk replied.
Tarhoon felt the point about not making a plan slipping into his favor. That's an excellent suggestion, he responded dryly.
Inspiration. I'm an inspiration man, Shirk clarified.
Shirk, you realize he entered our heads through magic. For all we know, he's listening in as we speak,
Elwood pointed out. Tarhoon had to admit, Elwood made a good point.
Well then, tell us, what are you gonna do when we get in there? Shirk responded.
The group went silent for a moment. A bird, the first they had heard in a while, twittered happily in a bush nearby.
Thank you, Shirk told the bird. Input not required, though.
After a moment, he sighed, defeated.
Let's just go, I guess.
His shoulders slumped. Tarhoon walked onward, bringing the ultimately fruitless, but quite entertaining conflict to end in his favor.
I'm just gonna turn invisible when we get there,
Shirk grumped quietly.
I don't think he won't see you,
Elwood said ominously without turning.
Just because he can get in my head doesn't mean he's got eyes on me, Shirk retorted.
Elwood was wringing out dangling bits of cloth onto the ground as they walked, breaking out into spotty bits of arguing about the river crossing, which fell into silence after a short time. Tarhoon was fully aware of his own smugness and didn't mind it. He had been right. During one of these arguments, the topic suddenly changed. "What is our plan going to be when we cross the next river?" he asked the rest of the group.
Oh, now we're making plans. Great! Finally,
Shirk responded sarcastically. "Let's," Elwood began, and then Shirk cut him off.
"Let's tie ropes to trees and not charge across,"
Shirk said, looking directly at Tarhoon. Tarhoon glared back, and then Shirk looked at Elwood.
"And not jump on people's backs."
So, basically what I was suggesting. Tarhoon raised his eyebrows.
So,
Shirk ignored him, but Elwood interrupted him this time. "Or we could chop down a tree if it's available."
"Here's my idea,"
Shirk said. He pulled the rope from where it was attached to his pack.
"We're going to tie one side to one side of the tree. Then we're going to throw the rope to the other side with a big heavy rock, or maybe an arrow or something. Try to hit a tree."
He paused to contemplate, then moved on.
"The strongest one among us should go across, tie off the rope, then the next Wait, who should go next then?"
"It could literally be anyone,"
Elwood said. "As long as the rope is sturdily tied and still being held onto, it shouldn't be much of a problem," Tarhoon told him. "Strength-wise."
"All right then,"
Shirk nodded.
"And how will we get the rope from the other side of the river? To the side we've crossed to?"
Fee asked quietly. "Tie it in the right kind of knot," Tarhoon smirked.
"Wait, forget that.
Shirk's eyes narrowed in thought.
"Tie it off from one side of a tree, and then we tie it around the waist of the person who's going to cross first."
"We saw how well that went when you tried it," Tarhoon said, every inch of his smile apparent in his voice. Shirk's eyes widened.
No! Okay, so..." He floundered. "Because you like rivers so much, Tarhoon, we tie off a rope to the tree on our side, then we tie it on to you. You would walk across, we would all hold the rope so you don't possibly die. When you get across, unwrap it, tie it to a tree, and then we go."
Shirk nodded, feeling confident.
"Wouldn't we untie it, tie it to the strongest person still on our side of the river?"
Elwood trailed off. "My plan," Tarhoon began to say, but Shirk cut him off.
I'm thinking a tree is a bit stronger than anyone, he said.
My plan, Tarhun said, much more forcefully now.
For the last person we can do that,
Fee told El, cutting Tarhun off again. My plan, Tarhun shouted, finally getting the other's attention, is that we have the most intelligent among us attempt to tie a knot that is sturdy, but can be undone from the other side of the river. They walked in silence after that, and night fell quickly. They hadn't seen any other zombies yet, which Tarhun decided portended well. They could just make out the falling light of the sun shining off the surface of the next river in front of them.
This is strange. You'd think there would be more guards the closer we get to the tower, Elwood mused.
He could be actively trying to keep them away from us, Tarhun replied.
We are between sections of the river, Fee piped up. Maybe they all drowned.
Also, we don't trust him. It's probably pretty likely he doesn't trust us, Tarhun added.
Shall we set up camp before we go across the next one? Fee asked.
I believe it would be wise to set up camp next to the river, Tarhun confirmed. It's an excellent source of water, and it's not like anything is going to attack us from that direction. As he looked to the right, he saw Elwood in his usual perch up in the tree.
Rivers again. Yay,
Shirk replied dryly. Tarhun suspected the tone covered up a deeper feeling, and he had to admit he was feeling some trepidation as well, especially in light of the last event. They found a nice sandy shoal that led up to the riverside, and then they set up camp. Tarhun doffed his armor and was pleased to see the warm sun had dried it thoroughly before any permanent damage was done, and that the water hadn't made it through the seal on the inside of his pack. Tarhun saw that this river was wider than the last stretch, but in the dark he couldn't see how deep it was.
Tarhun! Tarhun, come over here!
Shirk waved him over, and Tarhun begrudgingly approached.
Do you see the bottom of the river? It's so beautiful! Can you see it, huh?
No, he's blind in the dark,
Elwood told Shirk from up in the tree.
Oh,
Shirk said patronizingly, before smirking and returning to the camp. Tarhun clenched his fists tightly, but made no move. Fee went into the wood to collect firewood. Tarhun noticed the trees in this area of the woods were getting larger now, with each being roughly a foot in diameter and only getting wider. Tarhun could see Shirk doing something in the river. Shirk suddenly splashed into it, muttering,
crawdad.
He pulled a small crustacean from the water. He walked over to the camp and impaled it on a spit before roasting it on the fire. Tarhun was surprised by 2 beef sticks that fell onto his head. It's food! Eat it! Elwood said from above. I have my own rations. Thank you, Tarhun shouted tersely up at him.
I'm going to eat these, then.
Fee scooped them out of Tarhun's hands. Tarhun brought some of his own rations from his pack and began to eat.
Hey, guys. We're being watched by the thing that was attacking the barricade,
Elwood said tentatively from the tree. Shirk looked up at him.
You want to say that a little quieter?
Shirk whispered harshly, but loudly enough that he may as well not have bothered. It's just watching, Elwood told them. He was calmly waving at something across the river, but Tarhun's vision couldn't pierce the darkness too far outside the fire.
Smile and wave, boys and girls, smile and wave, Elwood said aloud.
What do you see? Tarhun asked the others.
I don't know, Fee responded. Just some tall thing. Did you see anything else, Elwood? Possibly another one of those mushroom things. The one we met with the log. Following behind it,
Elwood said, looking into the shadows.
I think it was the short little creatures we tried capturing. The one that I tried to catch in the bear trap,
Shirk guessed. Whether or not we're under the Forest King's protection, we should post a guard, Tarhun suggested.
Sounds good, Fee agreed.
Sounds like you're volunteering, Shirk replied.
I think it would be wiser to have someone who can actually see in the dark, Tarhoon rebutted.
Okay, but I don't want to get
Shirk began. I think you would be an excellent volunteer. Tarhoon smirked.
I don't want to get kidnapped again,
Shirk said, looking nervous. Tarhoon ignored his pleas, turned over in his bedroll, and closed his eyes.
I am not being kidnapped,
Shirk raged from behind him.
Shirk,
El called.
Shirk, shut up.
Shirk clammed up after that.
If you're so concerned, climb a tree.
I'm not like you,
Shirk said despairingly.
Look at these hand claws. They're not meant for climbing trees.
Then climb into a bush, Elwood retorted playfully.
You don't...
Shirk's face hardened. He packed up all of his gear again, and he walked back into Tarhoon's vision, straight up to the nearest tree. Tarhoon sat up to see what would happen. Shirk began to climb, and he was surprisingly good at it. He deftly scaled the tree to a fairly high limb.
Welcome to the Treeborn,
Elwood told him, amused but earnest.
Well, you boys have fun up there,
Fee called up to them.
I will,
Shirk replied happily.
Which one of you is taking first watch?
Fee asked politely.
I will,
Elwood volunteered, although he didn't sound enthusiastic.
Might as well.
I want the second one,
Shirk told them. Tarhoon rolled his eyes, closed them, and went to sleep.